let's begin. So, so last time we were examining some of these halachot about a little bit about Chatzi Shiur and a little bit about eating on Yom Kippur for people who need to eat. There's this idea that you start with less than a shiur, with spaces of kadei achilat pras in between what you eat. So we discussed all of that, and one of the things that we brought up, or at least that I brought up, that I remembered that I'd seen a while back, and I found it is this tshuva from Rav Moshe. This is the Igrot Moshe Arach Chaim Chelik Gimel Siman Tzadi, and it doesn't have a date. It usually has a date on the tshuvot. I have a feeling it's a tshuva to the person from the previous tshuva of Ephraim Greenblatt, who was somebody he corresponded with a lot, and the tshuva is from Tafshin Lamed. So that would have been 1970. So this goes back a while. But for Moshe, that was one of his later tshuvas. Orach Chaim Chelik Gimel. This was one of the later volumes of the Igrot Moshe. So this is the question: Im misha asur lo lihitanot b'yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. V'ayedei zrikat refuah ayedei tchivat machat begufo yuchal lihitanot im tzarich lasot kein olo. Okay, so it's talking about someone for whom it is forbidden to fast on Yom Kippur. So we have an idea of what that means. It means under doctor's orders, he wasn't allowed to fast. So the question was, the way Rav Moshe puts it is, right, can he get like an infusion, a medical infusion by sticking a needle into his body so that he could fast? Does he have to do this or not? In other words, you could hook him up to an IV, basically. You can you can just put him on a simple solution that will keep him, keep his body nourished, and then he doesn't have to eat anything. So the question is, so this is a fellow who is forbidden to eat, but maybe he should, the way the question
to fast. Forbidden
right?
to fast.
He's forbidden to fast, right? He's not allowed to fast. And but there is a way around it by hooking him up to an IV. And so does he have to do that? That's the way the question is phrased. Does he have to do that? So it's not a very long tshuva. I'm not going to go through all of it. It is interesting. He brings up some other sort of interesting conceptual issues, but here I'll just read a part of it. Right in the beginning, he says, regarding somebody for whom it is forbidden to fast, if they will, infuse him with a medication by sticking a needle into his body, he could fast. But Moshe says, "Pashut lefi aniyudati," right? It seems obvious to me. It's obvious to me that he doesn't have to do this. So he goes into all these reasons why. Ultimately, he holds, not only does he not have to do it, he brings up the possibility that may be forbidden for him to do it. There are a couple of reasons why it might be forbidden. One of them is a kind of a conceptual reason, but the one is a kind of a straightforward reason, because you're not allowed to harm yourself bodily. And in particular, just like you're not allowed to stab somebody, you're not allowed to stab yourself. You're not allowed to hit someone. You're not allowed to hit yourself. The only difference between you harming another person and harming yourself is not that it's not asur, it's asur for you to harm yourself. It's just that you won't pay yourself damages, right? If you do it to someone else, you have to pay damages. If you do it to yourself, you don't pay damages, but there's still an isur of harming yourself. So sticking a needle into yourself, unless it's for a refuah, is just damaging yourself. And so even though here, if you would stick a needle into him, it's all like it's a huge damage. It's not like it's like a terrible wound. Although, by the way, that really depends. I'm sure you know, right? Because if it's a very elderly person or a person who has certain kinds of medical issues, sticking a needle into them needlessly may have other effects, right? It may have other harms. But this is how he sums it up in the end. He says, since there is no obligation to do this in any event, then you should be concerned about the Isur, right? The forbidden aspect that I wrote. And the forbidden aspect, it has to do like with a more conceptual issue. I'm going to leave it. And sticking the needle into him is right? He's wounding himself, and a person is not allowed to wound himself because it's not for healing purposes. In other words, if the doctor had ordered him to go into the hospital and put him on an IV, then that's what you would do, right? Whether it's Yom Kippur, whether it's not Yom Kippur, that's what you would do. But here, this is voluntary, right? It's an option. So he's saying you don't do that unless there's a medical reason to do it. But the doctor is telling him that the doctor is not ordering it, and the doctor is telling him he's not allowed to fast. So that means he has to eat on Yom Kippur. And now this is also an interesting thing that he says. And he says, and this is actually a very wise statement. He says, look, any medication has its own doubt attached to it. In other words, any medication is risky. So even if they're just putting him on a saline solution or something like that, it's not really a fancy medication. But he says, there's always a doubt that it might have some kind of a harm, even if the doctors don't know what that harm might be. So therefore, only for medical reasons do you take drugs into your mouth, and all the more so for getting a shot into your body or sticking a needle into your body, that you don't do that unless it's for a medical reason, because there's a fear that you may damage something else, you may ruin something else in the body, and you're not allowed to do that just so that he could fast even on Yom Kippur, and all the more so for the other fast days that he shouldn't do that. So that's how Rav Moshe had. I just thought everybody might be interested in that. I did find another later tshuva from Rav Waldenberg, but I'm not going to go through it now. I didn't bring it up. It's a little more detailed, and it's not exactly the same question. Rav Waldenberg was the Tzitz Eliezer. He was the Rav of Sharei Tzedek for many, many years. And he's one of the, in the last generation, he was one of the outstanding poskim in general, but especially in medical issues.
So just to clarify, would a corollary of Rav Moshe's tshuva be that if an injection is medically required, it's not only permitted, but it's required, even on Yom
Yes.
Kippur. Okay.
Yes. It's not a corollary. It's actually it's like a basis. It's part of the basis of what he's saying. But I understand why you put it that way. But yes, that he essentially says that by implication. Okay, so I think now we're going to go back to the Gemara. Let me make sure that you can see it. And we're going to continue in the Sugya. The Gemara here is going to talk about Inui Nefesh. There's a few things that we want to know. So, okay, so we finished essentially the Sugya of Chatzi Shiur. We discussed that. And last week we looked at the halachot about that. And now we're going to go into some of the drashot that are related to Inui Nefesh. As we'll see. We'll just jump right in. So the Gemara says, this is here on Ayin Daled Amud Bet. Tanu Rabbanan. We learn in a Braita. Ta'anu et nafshotechem. Right? Torah says, Ta'anu et nafshotechem. What's the whole pasuk? This is in Achrei. This is the first pasuk that talks about in Achrei Not. Vayta lachem lechukat olam. B'chodesh hashvi'i b'asor lechodesh. Ta'anu et nafshotechem. V'chol melacha lo ta'asu. Ha'ezrach v'ager hagar b'tochechem. So the Gemara here is going to learn some things out because of the juxtaposition of Ta'anu et nafshotechem to the Chol Melacha Lo Ta'asu. We'll see how that goes. So first, let's just understand Ta'anu et nafshotechem. So Ta'anu et nafshotechem sounds like, right, so we translate that, right? You shall afflict your souls, right? Like you'll afflict yourselves. So that sounds like what? Like if nobody told you what that meant, if nobody told you that means don't eat, what would you think that Ta'anu et nafshotechem means?
Like afflict your spirit to like I would not necessarily think that it means sort of mortification of the flesh in one way or another.
Actually, that's an interesting point. Although usually nefesh refers
to life.
Nefesh, yeah, to life, right? To living things. But it's interesting you say that. I actually hadn't even thought of that. But what you're saying is not necessarily wrong. I wouldn't discount it as a possible perush. So, like to afflict your souls, not maybe it doesn't mean anything physical at all. I guess I want to.
Although I mean, I guess Tanu also sounds like it's an action rather than a restraint.
Right.
So it's something instead of standing from something, you're required to do something to yourself.
Right. It's a transitive verb. Ta'anu et. You should afflict this. Right. You should do something to this. So that's what it sounds like. So that's where the Gemara starts from. This is where the Braita starts from. It says, Tanu nafshotechem, yachol yeshev b'chama o b'tzina kedei sheyitzta'er. So when I read the words Tanu nafshotechem, maybe that means that I should sit in the heat or I should sit in the cold in order to afflict myself, in order to give myself.
Don't worry about me. I'll sit in the dark.
Right. In other words, but the idea is that maybe you should actively put yourself in a position of affliction. Talmud lomar v'chol melacha lo tasu. But the Torah continues, right? We saw this is the mamash, the next part of the pasuk. It says you should not do any melacha. So what do we learn from that juxtaposition? Ma melacha shev va'al ta'aseh, afinui nefesh shev va'al ta'aseh. So just as melacha is sit and don't do, in other words, it's passive. It's a passive thing. You don't do melacha, meaning you abstain from doing melacha. So we'll say also inui nefesh is to sit and not do. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but on the face of it, this is how the Gemara, this is how the Breita begins. So the Breita, so what's the Breita saying? What do I learn from this Breita?
That this apparently either that this apparently active verb is referring to something passive, or that abstaining itself is abstaining from something itself can be read as an action, at least in this context.
Okay, and either way, we're not going to actively do something to afflict ourselves. So if it's Yom Kippur falls out on a hot day, we're not obliged to go out and sit in the sun and suffer. And if it falls out on a cold day, we're not obliged to sit outside or put ourselves in a cold place. Rather, we just don't do. Now it doesn't tell us what Sheva al Taseh. At this point, the Gemara hasn't said to us exactly what it is that we're not doing, but we already know, right? We already know from the Mishnah that we're talking about not eating and not drinking, and then the other inuyim that are mentioned in the Mishnah. Whether those are d'oraita or d'Rabbanan is a question that we'll get to ultimately. It's a machloket mishanim, but okay. But I will point out, right? There's a difference linguistically, of course, between these two parts of the pasuk because of what Michael Werner laid out. Tanu et nafshotechem. Tanu is a transitive verb. Kol melacha lo ta'asu. It's telling me kol melacha. It's telling me to be passive. Don't do melacha. The tanu is a positive, right? It's telling me to do something. So it's a bit of a chidush for the Breita to learn from melacha to inui nefesh. But this is where the Breita begins. So the Gemara challenges this somewhat. It says the Yoma, and I could say, or let me say, Heichadiativ b'shimsha b'chayim le lo nema le kum tuv betula. So I could say, when he's sitting in the sun and it gets hot, don't say to him, get up and sit in the shade. Yativ betula b'karir le lo nema le kum tuv b'shimsha. And likewise, if he's sitting in the shade and it's cold for him, don't say to him, get up and sit in the sun. So the Gemara here is saying this as a challenge to what the Breita said. Right? So what's the challenge? What is the Gemara challenging here?
So the initial assumption is you need to do something to anew, but and what the Gemara is saying, maybe it just means not to make yourself comfortable.
Not exactly. What again? What did we conclude from the Breita regarding inui nefesh?
That refers to refraining from something as opposed to doing something.
Right. And so now what's the Gemara challenging about that?
So the Gemara is saying, well, if somebody is doing something, an action, something active that is afflictive, don't correct, say don't do that. Oh shit.
Uh-oh. Okay. I'm hoping that Michael Werner can hear us, but what he said is correct. In other words, the Gemara is saying, Gemara is saying like this. Okay, so you're saying Inui Nefesh is Sheva al Ta'aseh. So let's say a person is in a situation by default where he's suffering. Maybe he's in the sun and it's getting too hot. Maybe he's in the cold and it's getting too cold. So why didn't I say that Tanu et nafshotechem would mean to me, like if it's a Sheva al Ta'aseh, but maybe I'm also not in any way obliged to tell him to make himself more comfortable, right? To leave the hot sun or to leave the cold igloo or whatever it is that he's in, right? The Ema, right? Where he's sitting in the sun, in other words, where he's already sitting in the sun and it's getting too hot, then maybe it means don't tell him to get up out of the sun. Or if he's sitting in the shade and it's getting too cold, maybe I shouldn't tell him to get up and sit in the sun. So the Gemara says, right, and so that based on what we know so far, it's not unreasonable, right? Because we're just saying now that Inui Nefesh is a passive thing. Okay, so he's being passive, but he's getting afflicted by dint of where he's sitting. So maybe the point of Tanuat Nafshotechem is don't remove yourself from an affliction. So the Gemara says, Dumi de Malacha. The Gemara says, no, it's like Malacha. Ma Malacha lo chilakta ba. Af inui lo tachlok ba. Just like Malacha, you didn't differentiate, you didn't divide, right? So also Inui, you don't differentiate. So what does that mean? What does it mean? Ma Malacha lo chilakta ba. Just like Malacha, you didn't differentiate. This is hard, right? It's not obvious what the Gemara is trying to say. I see Michael Schwartz shaking his head. Right, so let's look at Rashi. Let's see how Rashi understands this. So Rashi on the Braita, right? And the Braita says, Ma malacha sheva al taseh. Just like malacha is a passive thing, you sit and you don't do. Rashi says, Ma mitzvat melachot sheva al taseh. Just like the mitzvot, the mitzvah of the melachot are sheva al taseh, the things that you don't do. Af mitzvat inui sheva al taseh. Sheva al taseh davar hamivatel mimcha et ha'inui. Right. So mitzvat inui is also sit and don't do that which will cancel out the inui from you. Ve'enzu ela kegon handamat nitin. And what would that be? Those are the things that are in the Mishnah. Don't eat, don't drink, don't wash. So I'm going to rephrase Rashi. Rashi's trying to read this into the words of the Gemara, and it's a little hard to understand exactly what he means. But what he means is, so if we want to say that Inui Nefesh is a Sheva al Taseh, just like Melacha is a Sheva al Taseh. So what is it that you're not doing? So Rashi says, don't do the thing that would cancel out your affliction. So what would that, so the way we're afflicting ourselves are these things that are mentioned in the Mishnah. We don't eat, we don't drink, etc. So don't do something that will cancel out your fast, meaning don't eat. That's how Rashi reads the Braita, right? That's what.
So
Go ahead.
if I understand then, so if you're in a state of inui, you don't do something to remove that state.
Excellent. Very well put. Right. You don't do something to remove yourself from the state of inui. And so then that leads us into the question of the Gemara. So if you don't do something to remove yourself from the inui, then why don't we say that if someone's sitting in the sun, we don't tell them to leave? Or if they're sitting in the cold, we don't tell them to leave, because they're afflicted because of where they happen to be sitting. So just like I was saying, don't be mevatel the inui of the tzom by eating. So also don't be mevatel the inui of the heat or the cold, and don't move from where you are. So the Gemara pushes back on that and says, no, it's like malacha. Just like malacha lo chilakta ba. So Rashi says, ma malacha lo chilakta ba b'chutz tada asura. Just like in a malacha, you didn't differentiate, meaning all sides of a malacha. In other words, malacha is asur in all events. Afinui nami she'isuro b'chutz tada kamar. So inui also, it's asur in any event. Yatsu chamavet tina shim yeshev harehu bi'inui v'im lo yeshev eno mitzuveh leshev. In other words, this is not like the person who's sitting in the sun or sitting in the cold, because why? Because that's a circumstance that can change. But the inuyim that Chazal told us are things that don't change. They're things that are asur all day, no matter what. Right? So you're not allowed to eat all day, no matter what. But being extra hot or being extra cold, that's situational, and that can change during the day, with or without your input. So those things which are external to you that you don't that you can't control, and which are changeable circumstances, those don't apply. So you're not. So the sacha kol of it is, or at the conclusion is, that you're not. No one is obliged to actively afflict themselves. You passively afflict yourself, and the way you passively afflict yourself is by not eating, drinking, washing, etc. And those are things that you have to stick to all day, regardless of what your circumstances are. But if you find yourself in an uncomfortable position, if you're in a shul and it's very stuffy, and you think you're getting hot and you might faint, you're under no obligation to, you might say, oh, it's Yom Kippur, I should feel bad. No, you don't have to do that, right? You're allowed to leave and go outside and get some air. That's just a little example. So, but it's an interesting point. So the Gemara wants to say, so this kind of drasha, right? We call it a hekesh. A hekesh is basically just learning from context. So the context is Tanu Nafshotechem. I'll learn out something about Tanu Nafshotechem from Kol Melacha Lo Tasu, because I see that the Torah itself is putting them, as it were, in the same breath. So it's telling me something about Inui Nefesh. So what I'm learning right at this point is that Inui Nefesh is like Melacha. So why is it that I'm learning out from Melacha to Inui Nefesh? Why didn't I learn out from Inui Nefesh to Melacha? Well, Inui Nefesh is an exceptional case, right? In other words, Melacha is something that we see by Shabbat and the Yamim Tovim. In other words, Melacha has a wider context. So when I come to this pasuk in Achrei Mot, I already know what it means not to do Melacha. But I don't know what it means to be Ma'aneh et HaNefesh. So it stands to reason that I'm going to learn out Inui Nefesh from Melacha and not vice versa, right? What the Gemara is laying out now, and we'll see from the next part of the Sugya, the Gemara is laying out the both the textual and the conceptual basis for our understanding of Inui Nefesh, which is not obvious, right? Because as we said, Tanuit nafshotechem sounds like you should be actively doing something to make yourself suffer on Yom Kippur. So this is already a big chidush from Chazal. They're saying, no, you don't actively do something, you passively do something. You don't eat and you don't drink, etc. Okay, and I'll say it's like Melacha. So just like Melacha, once Shabbat begins, or once Yom Tov begins, or once Yom Kippur begins, there's no chiluk in Melacha. In other words, whatever you're not allowed to do that's a Melacha, you're not allowed to do it under any circumstances throughout the whole Shabbat, etc. So the same thing when Inui Nefesh starts on Yom Kippur, then we're not mechalek. That is, we don't say there are different kinds of Inui Nefesh depending on our circumstances. Just like the circumstances for Melacha don't change, so also the circumstances for Inui Nefesh don't change. And if you find yourself in a situation that does change, like sitting in the sun or sitting in the cold, then that's not really part of Inui Nefesh. That's something else. Okay, so now the Gemara goes on and says, Tanya Ida. So we learn in another Breita. So this Breita is also going to darshan the same pasuk. Ta'anu et nafshotechem, yachol yeshev b'chama v'tzina v'yitzta'er, Talmud lomar v'chol melacha lo ta'asu. Ma melacha davar shechayavin alav b'makom acher, af inui nefesh shechayavin alav b'makom acher. Ve'eze zeh, zeh pigul v'notar. Okay, this is already a little bit more obscure, so let's go through this carefully. So we start off with the same pasuk. Tanu et nafshotechem. We start off with a similar beginning point. Yachol yeshe b'chamal v'tzina v'yitzta'er. When the pasuk says you have to afflict yourselves, maybe that means you have to sit in the heat or the cold and be uncomfortable. But then the Torah says right after it, don't do any melacha. So now we have a different drasha. Ma melacha. So what am I going to learn from melacha? Ma melacha, davar shechayavin alav b'makom acher. Melacha is a thing which the Torah makes me chayav for in another place. Af inui nefesh shechayavin alav b'makom acher. So also inui nefesh must be something that the Torah made me chayav for in another place. And what is that? That's pigul and notar. So what does all that mean? What does all that mean? What is it? Oh, here, it's just a second. Michael Warner is going to hopefully join us again. Hi, Michael. Okay. I'm just we're on to the next part of the sugya. You didn't miss that much, but you missed a little bit. We'll go over it in the audio. So we have a second Breita, which begins in a similar way to the previous Breita. And it says, we say, Tanya Idach, we learn in another Braita, tell and be uncomfortable. Talmud Lomar v'chol melacha lo tasu. But the Torah says you shouldn't do any melacha. So what do I learn out from not doing any melacha? Just as melacha is a thing for which you're chayav in another place. Davar shechayavin ela b'makom acher. Af inui nefesh shechayavin ela b'makom acher. So inui nefesh is also something where the Torah made you chayav in another place or in another circumstance. And what's the other circumstance? The Torah made you chayav for eating pigul and notar. So let's break this down to understand what the Gemara is saying. Let's follow the logic. So what's the logic? Melacha is something that you're chayav in another place. So what is it? So let's just think about that for a minute. Melacha davar shechayavin ela b'makom acher. The Torah makes you chayav for melacha in another place. What does that mean? That you're chayav in melacha for melacha in another place or another circumstance. Here are the circumstances that you're not allowed to do melacha on Yom Kippur. Where else are you not allowed to do melacha?
Shabbat.
Shabbat.
Right? So on Shabbat, you're not allowed to do melacha. So melacha, first of all, is a thing that doesn't appear only here by Yom Kippur. Yisur melacha is something that appears by Shabbat. And by Shabbat, if you do melacha, you're chayav karet. So I want to learn out from that here the Torah is saying, I have to be ma'aneh et hanefesh. And my understanding of that is already that it means I'm not allowed to eat. I have to refrain from eating. So where else am I chayav karet if I don't refrain from eating? So the Gemara says that's pigul v'notar. What does it mean? Because you're not allowed to eat pigul v'notar. If you do eat pigul v'notar, then you're chayav karet. So if we change the wording here a little bit, when the Gemara here says af inui nefesh, so the Braita here is assuming inui nefesh means refraining from eating. So just like melacha, meaning just like not doing melacha is something that you're not allowed to do on Yom Kippur and also not on Yom Kippur, even on Shabbat. So also refraining from eating is something that you have to do. And that if you don't do it in another place, you'll also be chayav karet. So, what is that? That's pigul v'notar. So, what did I gain from this?
We understand from this that inui nefesh refers to fasting.
Yes. So here's the question. In other words, I have to think of inui nefesh as refraining from doing something, right? So, because how does the Braita begin? The Braita begins also with the same havamina I had in the previous Braita. Ta'anu et nafshotechem. Maybe that's an active thing. Maybe it means I have to put myself into a physically uncomfortable situation. But then I say, no, inui nefesh is like malacha. And so just like melacha, if you do a melacha on Yom Kippur and you're chayav, and I know that if you do a melacha, you're chayav karet also on Shabbat. So then I'll say, inui nefesh must be like, again, because of the hekesh, because of the proximity in the, not just the proximity, but the context of the pasuk, where Tanu nafshotechem and Kol Melacha Lo Tasu are in the same context. So inui nefesh must also be something which I'm going to be chayav for in another place. Just like melacha, the Torah is mechayev oti b'makom acher. Agam inui nefesh, the Torah mechayevet oti b'makom acher. So where else is the Torah mechayevoti for not restraining myself from something that will benefit my nefesh? That would be, I have to restrain myself from eating pigul v'notar.
I mean,
So as you see,
I mean, why I'm just curious. It would seem to me that refraining from eating chametz on Pesach would be. I mean, that would be for me. That would be. I mean, why is pigul notar the example and not refraining from eating chametz on Pesach?
that's a reasonable question. I'm going to ask you to hold off on it until we go through the whole Breita. But remember the question. Remember the question. It's an important question. At this point, right now, it could be that would have been that the Breita could have said chametz b'Pesach. It could be. So that's why I say keep it in mind. But why the Gemara, why the Breita chooses pigul v'notar, we'll see it falls into a line of thinking which we haven't gone through yet. Before we go on in the Breita, let's just look at Rashi here. So Rashi says, "Ma melacha davar shechayavin alav b'makom acher karet ki hacha." Just like melacha is a thing for which the Torah makes me chayav in another place. And what does it make me chayav? It makes me chayav karet, like it does here by Yom Kippur. Kagon b'Shabbat, for example, on Shabbat, I'm chayav karet for doing melacha on Shabbat. Af inui b'debar achila ka'amar. So also inui, afflicting myself in a matter of eating, is what it's saying. Shematzinu shechayav alav b'makom acher, kagon pigul v'notar. Right, and we see that in another place, for example, pigul and notar. So at this point, pigul and notar are chosen because they are examples of things that you're not allowed to eat, for which if you do eat, you're chayav karet. So could have also said chametz b'Pesach. But the advantage, I think, in the short term anyway, but I think you'll also see in the long term, like in the wider context, pigul v'notar are things that you're always not allowed to eat. And chametz, you're only not allowed to eat it for 1 week out of the year. But
actually, I had another hypothesis, which is that not eating chametz is attached to a positive commandment. So you don't eat chametz and you're required to eat matzah. Whereas pigul notar is simply an abstention, is simply a negative commandment with no positive attached to it.
I could argue that. I understand what you're saying. I could argue that, and I could say that actually the positive of pigul notar is to eat the korban as a kosher korban, right? In other words, let's leave it. Let's leave that for a moment. So at this point, what we're saying is, Yinui Nefesh, then, if I'm learning it from this pasuk, Tanu et nafshotechem, I'm going to say, Tanu et nafshotechem is like kol melacha lo tasu. I have to learn something out from the nature of melacha. So the nature of melacha on Yom Kippur is that it's going to be similar to the nature of melacha, let's say on Shabbat, where I'll be chayav karet. So also, Yinui Nefesh, I have to learn out from somewhere else, where, as it were, I'm anet nafshi to not eat something, and where I would also be chayav karet for eating it, and that's going to be pigul and notar. So then the Gemara, Breita says, avi pigul v'notar shehen b'karet. Okay, so based on this drasha, I'll bring in pigul v'notar, that they're for which you're chayav karet. V'lo avi et tevel she'eno bekaret, right? Tevel, if you eat tevel, you're chayav mita bidei shemayim, but not karet. So it's a lesser punishment. Talmud Lomar ta'anu v'initem et nafshotechem riba. The Torah says ta'anu, but it also says v'initem et nafshotechem riba. It comes to include, meaning it comes to add on something that I didn't get just from ta'anu. So before we go on, so let's understand the question. So based on what we learned in the beginning, we say, so what do I understand? That I'm going to bring in something. I'll learn out from Malacha that I have to understand Inui Nefesh on Yom Kippur vis-a-vis Inui Nefesh in another context. The Inui Nefesh in the other context is I'm not allowed to eat pigul v'notar. Just like Malacha is your chayav karet, so also eating pigul, I have to bring in something for which I'm chayav karet. So if I stopped right here, then what would I think the Isur of Inui Nefesh on Yom Kippur is?
Fasting and nothing else.
Well, maybe it's fasting only from things for which you're chayav karet. So the Breita doesn't want to stop here because that means as long as you don't eat pigul v'notar, for which you're chayav karet, then maybe you wouldn't, not that it's mutar to eat, but maybe you won't be chayav karet for eating anything else. In other words, just because let's think about it, right? With the same thing with Malacha, right? So Malacha on Shabbat is Asur, and it's a Chiyuv Karet. So if you do those same Malachot on Yom Kippur, you're also going to be Chayav Karet. So then I'll say the same thing by Inui Nefesh. Inui Nefesh b'makom acher is to not eat pigul v'notar, and if you do eat pigul v'notar, you're Chayav Karet. So if you eat pigul v'notar on Yom Kippur, you're Chayav Karet. You're chayav karet just because it's Yom Kippur. So avi pigul v'notar shein bekaret v'lo avi et tevel sheino bekaret. But I won't include not eating tevel because you're not chayav karet for eating tevel. Talmud Lamar ta'anu v'initem et nashotechem riba. Right? We say a little bit later in Achremot. Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem v'initem et nafshotechem chukat olam. Right, so the Torah gives us another pasuk of inui nefesh. So here we're saying, okay, that's a ribui. It's there to tell me something that I didn't learn from ta'anu. So at this point, so I'll say fine. So Yom Kippur is going to be like Malacha, that I'm not allowed to eat things for which I would be chayav karet in another context. I'm also not allowed to eat things for which I would only be chayav mita bidei shemayim in another context. Avi hatevel shehu b'mita, v'lo avi et nevera sheina b'mita. Right. So then I'll say, okay, but I'm not going to include not eating a nevera for which I'm also not chayav even mita bidei shemayim. I'm chayav makot, but not mita bidei shemayim. Talmud Lamar ta'anu v'initem et nafshotechem riba. From here on in, the Breita is going to be marbeh. They're going to be marbeh everything, apparently from the second pasuk, and I'm not sure about this, and I tried to find somebody who would explain this better. We only have these two instances of inui, per se. And it's going to learn out everything from them. So I'm not sure that this is really a drasha gemura, We'll talk about that. But we're going to go through these stages. So the first stage is I'm going to exclude things for which I'm chayav karet in another context. Second stage is I'm also going to exclude things for which I'm chayav mitabidei shemayim in another context. Then the third thing is I'm going to exclude things that are asur, in which I'm chayav makot in another context. And now I'm going to keep going. Aviyat nevela shehu belav. Okay, so I'll include things like nevela, which the Torah simply forbids, even though it's not a chiyuv karet and it's not a chiyuv mitabidei shemayim. But I won't bring chulin. In other words, just plain food that's not kodesh in any way, because there's no isur at all. Torah doesn't forbid me to eat chulin at all. So maybe if I eat chulin on Yom Kippur, that's not a chiyuv karet under this pasuk of Tanu et nafshotechem. Talmud Lomar ta'anu v'initam et nafshotechem riba. No, I'm going to include chulin also. So then, avia chulin sheinan bikum achol. So okay, I'll include chulin where that a non bikum achol, right? They're not in a mitzvah that tells me you have to get up and eat. In other words, the Torah never tells me that I have to eat chulin. There's no mitzvah in the Torah of eating chulin. So v'lo aviyata truma shehi bikum achol, but I wouldn't include truma, where the Torah does tell me, well, it tells kohanim, they do have to eat truma. Talmud Lomar ta'anu v'initam et nafshotechem riba. So you see, we're going up a ladder. We start off by things for which the Torah punishes you for eating. Mein hachamur el hakal, right? So the chamur is pigul v'notar because you're chayav karet. And then tevel because you're chayav mitabidei shemayim, and then nevera because it's an isur lav, and then I go into things that are essentially neutral. Chulin are neutral. They're neither things. It's not something that the Torah forbids you to eat. Neither is it something that the Torah makes you eat. You're not commanded to eat it. So I say, no, that's also included in Inui Nefesh. And then I say, okay, but maybe then I'm not going to include things which I'm commanded to eat, like Truma. So then we say, no, I'm going to include that also. Avia Truma she'ena beval totiru. So now I'm going to go into a slightly different direction. So I'll bring in the truma. I'll include truma that I'm not allowed to eat that on Yom Kippur, because truma doesn't have an isur associated with not eating it on time, right? There is no isur of baltotiru, not to leave over your truma. And I won't include kachim, in other words, korbanot, which do have an isur of bal tutiru. Talmud Lomar, ta'anu v'initem et nafshotechem riba. Right. So, what's the point of kachim? Kachim is, as it were, another step. It's another step removed. In each case, what I want to come out with at the end of this is that I'm not allowed to eat anything on Yom Kippur, regardless of the mitzvot that are attached to it. So I'm not allowed to eat things that are isur karet. And not only that, I'm not allowed to eat things that are isur mitabidei shemayim. Not only that, I'm not allowed to eat things that are just isur lav. And not only that, I'm not allowed to eat things for which there's no isur of eating them at all. And not only that, I'm not allowed to eat things for which there's a mitzvah to actually eat, like truma And not only that, I'm not allowed to eat things for which there's a mitzvah to eat them by a certain time, within a certain period of time. And that's kaddish. Ta'anu v'nitem and nafshotechem riba. V'im nafshach lomar, and if you want, you can say, Harehu omer b'ha'avadati et nefesh shahi. Inui shu abidat nefesh. It's an affliction which is the destruction of the soul, or this destruction of the person. And what's that? So what's v'havarati et nefesh ahi? So this is later on in Parshat Amor. B'chol hanefesh asher ta'aseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh v'havarati et nefesh ahi mikerav hama. So this is altogether a difficult drasha, and I'll show you in a moment how the Torah Tzimima understands it. But when we're reading the Braita, it's as if the Braita is saying what? When it says, V'im nafshach lomar, if you want, I'll learn out from Havarati et nefesh ahi that we're talking about Inui shu abidat nefesh, and that's achilat shtiyah. So what am I trying to learn out from Havarati et nefesh ahi? What I just said. I just want to make sure everybody is clear on this. What am I trying? What is the whole point of this Braita? What is this Braita trying to teach me?
This Braita is trying to teach us that Tanu Nafshatechem refers to eating and drinking in general, and not a specific category thereof.
Very good. Excellent. Exactly. So the whole first part of the Braita, like Tanu v'nitem riba, it wants to make sure that I understand that all manner of eating is asur on Yom Kippur. There are no exceptions. You're not allowed to eat anything on Yom Kippur. Even things that you might have thought for some reason, right? In other words, because we start off from a point of view that maybe I'm only not allowed to eat things on Yom Kippur that I'm not allowed to eat in another context. Because we said it's like melacha. Right, so just like melacha in another context is a chiyuv kareh, so maybe inui nefesh just means don't eat things where in another context you're not allowed to eat, but you could eat other things. So I essentially go through all these halachic categories of food to say every halachic category of food is asur on Yom Kippur. And I'll exclude it because of this ribui of Tanu v'nitem et nafshatechem. So that's the whole first part of the Braita. And then the second part of the Braita, which is quite short, it says, actually, I'll just learn it out from these words. V'havarati et nefesh ahi. So I'm going to destroy your soul. So what kind of inui is avedat nefesh? That's achila b'shtiyah. So this is a very strange drasha. This is a very strange drasha. And why is it so strange? Because as we just saw in the context, the pasuk itself isn't talking about inui nefesh. It's talking about melacha. Let's take a look. Wait a second. Sorry, let me just open this up. While I'm getting this ready, the other thing that's difficult, im nafshach lomar, if you want, you can say. What does that mean? If you want, you can say. I just gave you this whole long drasha to explain why you can't eat anything on Yom Kippur. So what do I need this other? Why do I need this other drasha for? If you want, I'll say. So the Gemara is going to ask that question. Let's just read that a little bit, but then let's go back and understand the drasha. So the Gemara says, "My v'im nafshach lomar." What is this v'im nafshach lomar? What does the Braita mean when it says, "If you want, you can say"? V'chi tema ba'arayot kamishtai. Maybe you'll say that when the Torah talks about inui nefesh, inuyim, maybe it's talking about arayot, that just you have to refrain from sex. Because inui is associated with sex in other biblical contexts, right? We have what does Lavan say to what we have two contexts for that, right? So one of them is that Mishpatim, where it says onata suta, what is it? That you're not lotigara, that if you have to marry a woman, you're not allowed to reduce her ona. So I understand ona in that context means sex, and in Lavan in Parshat Vayetze, right, when he's sending off, as it were, Yaakov after they make the brit at Galed, he says, "Im te'anet benotai," if you're me'aneh my daughters, and the way that's understood is if you deny them sex, then that's one of the ways it's understood, and we'll see that this is going to be brought as a proof text later. So I think we'll go into those a little bit more carefully. We'll go into that a little bit more carefully as the sugya continues. But at this point, the Gemara wants to say, why does the Braita bring the second drasha v'avadati et hanefesh? Because maybe you'll say that when the Torah says ta'anu v'initem, it's talking about arayot, that you have to refrain from sexual intercourse. So that's why it says v'avadati hanefesh inui sheyesh bo avedat nefesh ve'ezeh za'achila shtiya. So that's why I bring the second drasha, so that I understand that the inui that's being spoken of is only talking about eating and drinking. That is, it's something that if you're afflicted with, it will destroy your very life. Okay, this is all still a little bit foggy. So let's go back and I'll just show you Rashi, but I want to finish off. I'll show you what the Torah Tumima says about this. V'im nafshach lomar. So this is Rashi on the Braita. V'im yesh bi'achad hashiva zeh harei ra'aya acher. Right. So what im nafshach lomar, just as a phrase, it means maybe you can refute the whole first drasha. So I have another piece of evidence. I have another proof. Dikra shel te'anu et nafshotechem inui shu'avedat nefesh b'toch chalal haguf mayri. That the second pasuk that we brought of ta'anu, the first pasuk that we brought of ta'anu et nafshotechem is referring to an affliction, which is destruction of the physical body that's inside of your body. That's what it's talking about. And so that's going to be achila b'shtiya. Okay, so how does that drasha work? Second. Okay. So here we are in Parshat Emor. In Parshat Emor, it says, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, ach be'asur lechodesh hashvi'i hazeh Yoma Kippurim hu mikra kodesh yelachem v'initem et nafshotechem." Right, that was the second pasuk that we had of v'initem. Yikravtem mishel Hashem. V'chol melacha lo ta'asu be'etzem hayom hazeh. The next pasuk says you're not allowed to do any melacha. Ki Yoma Kippurim hu l'chaper alechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. Ki chol hanefesh asher lo tu'uneh be'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichrita me'ameh. Right? If you don't afflict any person who doesn't afflict themselves in this day, it was chayav karet. V'chol hanefesh asher ta'aseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh. I will destroy that person from the midst of their people. So, Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem yinitem b'nafshotechem tisha l'chodesh be'erev me'erev ad erev tishbetu Shabbatchem. So here, the psukim are divided up a little bit differently than we saw in Acharei Mot. So in Acharei Mot, we have a single pasuk where it says, "Ta'anu et nafshotechem v'chol melacha lo ta'asu." And here it says, "V'initem et nafshotechem," and then after that it says, "Kol melacha lo ta'asu," and then it goes back over them one by one. So it has first Yinui Nefesh, and then Melacha. That's Pasuk Kav Zayin, Pasuk Kav Chet. That's the Isur, or what we know from, right? That's the Azhara. And then the Onesh, in Pasuk Kav Ten, is the Onesh for Inui, Kol Nefesh Asher Lo Tuneh V'Nichrita. And then the punishment for Melacha we see in Pasuk Lamed. Kol nefesh asher ta'aseh kol melacha v'havadati et nefesh. So there's a shinui lashon here of havadati et nefesh. We already saw that doing melacha on Yom Kippur. We already saw that that's an isur karet, right? Didn't bring the pasuk. Hold on a second. Okay, we'll come back to that. So, so here the Gemara that we just saw, right? The Brisa says, "I'm going to learn out from the Havadati et Nefesh Shahi Mikerav Ama something about Inui Nefesh, that it's a Achila v'Shtiyah." So the first thing I want to point out is that Havadati et Nefesh Shahi seems to be a variation, a different way of saying that you're chayav karet. Because I know that you're chayav karet mimakom acher for doing melacha. Instead of saying you're chayav karet, it says that that havadati et nefesh. So we have to take note that it's a shinui lashon. Let's look here for a moment at the Oh, that's why I opened that. Hold on a second. Let's look here at the Torah Tamima. Wait a second. I apologize. Getting confused. Here. Here we go. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not finding this, and I thought it was the Torah Tamima here. We're gonna stop here. I apologize. We'll go over this next time. Basically, what we want to understand is how does this pasuk of Bavadati at nefesh shahi, which the Torah says is the punishment for doing melacha, how does that explain anything to me about inui nefesh? Why the mazah shayach? Why? How is that? How does that get transposed, as it will? And even if it would, in other words, even if it would have said on the pasuk of Yinita Menashatechem Bevadati et nefesh shahi, I would still need to understand how the punishment of a dat nefesh. What does that tell me about inui nefesh? So it's still not clear. And there's a good explanation with Torah Tamima, which I thought I had open, and I apologize. I think it's actually right in front of me, but I think I'm too tired to see it, and I think it's getting late. So I apologize again. We'll leave it for now. I'll see you, God willing, next week. And everybody, take care.
And thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.